Welcome back to the Plus Ultra podcast. This is Tracy R. Twyman. Now comes part 2 of our interview with Peter Levenda, author of Unholy Alliance, A History of Nazi Involvement with the Occult, and the brand new 3-part series, Sinister Forces, A Grimoire of American Political Witchcraft. Later on we're going to get into the subject of the Necronomicon, which Levenda had some involvement with, and has even been rumored to be the author of. But first, a little necessary background information on the man Levenda. He's led an exciting life that started with him founding his own Orthodox church, attending the funeral of Robert Kennedy as a clergyman, and working as an unofficial intelligence asset for the U.S. military. Here once again is Peter Levenda. Peter, where did you grow up, and what sort of upbringing did you have?
Well, I grew up all around the country. I was born in New York City, but my parents moved around a lot as I was growing up. So we lived in Indiana, in Chicago for a number of years, in New Hampshire for a couple of years, but I basically graduated from high school in New York City. We eventually made our way back there. My father was a kind of a failed actor, and between one thing and another, our family just wound up wandering around the country looking for work.
And I understand that your father, at one point, was involved in something that has caused you a bit of embarrassment and got you some scrutiny from the government, too.
Yeah, his name is mentioned in a few books, mostly books written by academics about a particular period in the history of Gary, Indiana, which is where he was born and raised. And he was involved in something called the Gary School Strike, which I believe was 1945 or 1946, something like that. And that was a school strike that was started over integration. There was a move to integrate the public schools in Gary, Indiana. And my father was involved in some kind of debating team at Broble High School, which is where he was going to school. And he was the president of the Students' Union at the same time. And the debate was over whether or not the schools should be integrated or segregated. And my father came down on the segregation part and became kind of well known as a segregationist and as the leader of the Gary school strike. So basically he was a segregationist, and it caused so much furor in the country at the time that Frank Sinatra, who was on his way, I guess, to some gig in Chicago, decided he would stop over in Gary, Indiana, and try to solve the problem to the force of his own personality, I suppose. So he made a visit to the Gary High School auditorium, where there was a big meeting on the issue of integrating the schools, and he was not warmly received. He was seen basically as an outsider trying to come in and solve the problems. And not finding very much success there, he went to my father's home to try to convince him to call off the school strike. So you'll find in there's a book out, I believe, that's called The Frank Sinatra Files, which is a collection of the FBI files on Sinatra, particularly during this period, and my father's name is mentioned there a number of times. The FBI thought my father was a communist, which is the funniest thing, because they knew that Sinatra had some kind of associations with some leftist or socialist types, and they thought that Sinatra's presence in Indiana was some kind of a socialist thing, and therefore they were making the assumption that my father was somehow a communist, which was 180 degrees opposite from what he was. I mean, as a segregationist, he was a right-wing kind of John Bircher type, and there was no way on earth that you could mistake him for a communist. But at any rate, the FBI thought he might be, so they were collecting files on him.
How did your father react to having Frank Sinatra come over to his house?
He threw him out.
What was his name?
Leonard Levenda.
Now, I understand around the time you were going to graduate high school, you were staring the possibility of the draft in the face and trying to figure out how to get out of that, and you couldn't afford to go to college to use that as a way out. So you and a friend of yours named Andrew came up with a very unusual idea. Can you explain that to us?
Sure. Well, like many things in life, there's always more than one motivation. My friend and I were very involved in religious studies, let's say. I was very involved in studying religion. It had always been a fascination of mine since I was very young. And all forms of religion, including, extreme forms like occultism or mysticism on the one hand, and different religious groups on the other. I would haunt all sorts of churches and temples, whatever I could find, just to get some kind of an idea of what was going on. And I was very religiously minded in my late teens. I was really thinking seriously of some kind of religious vocation. And I had met a friend of mine in high school in the Bronx who had a similar background to mine. He was half Czech and half Slovak. And he also had a fascination for the church, but his fascination was more for the pomp and ceremony of it. Mm. He liked the vestments, and he liked the golden chalices and all the rest of it. And he liked the way in which clergymen were afforded all sorts of extra privileges that the rest of us didn't enjoy. And this was a different time, I have to remind you and your listeners. Back in the 1960s, clergymen had a lot of status. I mean, they wouldn't get charged going on a bus or a subway. People would just, allow them on for free. Just the kind of respect that they gave. A clergyman could walk into almost any building anywhere and be accorded all sorts of immediate respect. These days, of course, that's changed a lot, but in the old days, this was an old-fashioned kind of idea, and my friend really liked that. So, two of us were graduating high school in 1968, which pretty much meant we were probably going to Vietnam or something close to it. And my idea was, why not form a church? Because we knew that clergymen would not be drafted. So we formed a church. We organized a church around a man that we knew who was a bishop from Slovakia who was living as a displaced person in the United States. And he had a very checkered career in the church. He was involved with a church in Czechoslovakia. There was the invasion by the Nazis and the invasion by the Russians. And eventually he got out and came to the United States, and the church was sort of formed around him. So we got together and said, let's form a church. Let's use this guy as our spiritual leader, and we'll incorporate the church. And we'll become clergymen in the church.
You, of course, were 17 years old at the time?
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
Please continue. Just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, well, we were a little precocious, it's true. But, it was 1968, it was Vietnam. I mean, we were motivated. So the motivation was definitely there. And so we said, let's do this. And we incorporated it. Of course, we were too young, actually, to sign the incorporation papers ourselves. So we had to get other people to help us do that. And so we had adults sign off on papers, and we incorporated the church. And we held services. I mean, we held services every Sunday. We went and visited other churches in New York City. This was an Orthodox church.
Who came to the services?
Excuse me?
Did people come to the services?
Oh, sometimes. Friends of ours, perhaps. It got to the point where we had developed a kind of a small floating congregation, We were intent on doing this the right way, so we were trying to run a legitimate ecclesiastical type organization. I mean, that was the whole point. So what we did is we imposed upon a Protestant minister in the Bronx who had a church, a very nice Dutch Reformed church, and we managed to cut a deal with him that we would be able to use his church for services, on days when he wasn't using it. So he would have a service on Sunday, let's say at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, and then we would do something at 11 o'clock or whatever. So it worked out pretty well for a while.
This involvement with the church seems to have led to you being privy to the involvement of U.S. intelligence in these obscure Orthodox churches.
Sure.
At a certain point, you were actually asked by someone in the military to spy on other people in your church?
I'm not quite sure if military is the right word. It's kind of murky and ambiguous.
Okay.
I'll give you a little bit of the background on this. After the Kennedy funeral, as we were leaving the church, we ran into a couple of people who were dressed oddly and appeared to be people sort of similar to us. And they just asked us a few questions about what church we represented, etc. And they gave us a few brochures from their own church. They wanted to introduce themselves to us and wanted us to go visit them, and their church was in the Bronx also. So we decided we would check them out. And we went to the church. It was on 183rd Street and Arthur Avenue in the Bronx at that time. It's not there anymore. And it was a beautiful little building. And it was the headquarters of something called the American Orthodox Catholic Church, AOCC.
Mm-hmm.
And we became involved with them. We visited them on one Sunday. We hung out with them for a while. They had no clue that we were younger. We were under 21. They thought, with all of our robes and all of the knowledge that we had acquired, that we were at least in our 20s. This led to a kind of a contretemps later, but at the moment, everything was fine. We went along swimmingly in this relationship. And the head of that church, of the AOCC, was a man called Profeta, Walter Profeta, sometimes Vladimir Profeta. And he boasted of his relationships with U.S. intelligence. Now I'm only 17, 18 years old at this time.
And this is the American Orthodox Catholic Church is neither a normal Catholic church nor a normal Orthodox church, is it?
Yeah, you could say it's neither American nor Orthodox, but it was, well, Profeta himself was a Ukrainian. He was a priest in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is a legitimate denomination. And for reasons that are too long probably to go into here, he left the Ukrainian church and started this American Orthodox branch. There's a lot of background history to it, and it goes on, but basically the short form is he started his own church and became the bishop of his own church, and eventually the patriarch of his own church. So he gave himself a lot of titles. But as a Ukrainian, he was a dedicated anti-communist. Mm-hmm. I mean, this was his raison d'etre, was fighting communism. And he had been on television a number of times trying to alert the American people to the dangers of communism. He was a specialist in promoting the news about the Katyn Forest massacre, which the Soviets had instigated, killing a lot of Ukrainian people and burying them in ditches and all that sort of thing. So he was a prominent anti-communist. And he showed me once a letter that he received from Thomas Dewey, promising him he would be the White House chaplain when Dewey won the presidency. So remember, Dewey was running against Truman,
right.
And Profeta was packing his bags that night thinking that Dewey had won, and he was getting ready to become the chaplain. Of course, Truman won, and he was out. So that was going on, and then every once in a while, people would show up at the church in, black wingtips and white shirts and black ties, and they would go into Profeta's office and have little meetings in there. And Profeta would openly boast that on his board of directors he had one FBI agent and one CIA agent. So he told me all of this, and I carefully paid attention to it and filed it away. Little did I know the extent of his operation until years later when I began to read the declassified Kennedy assassination files and find out that the AOCC was kind of prominent, at least in Jim Garrison's mind, when he was conducting his investigation in New Orleans. Because David Ferry belonged to it, Jack Martin belonged to it. A lot of the supposed co-conspirators in the Kennedy assassination were members of the AOCC. They were not just lay members, they were bishops, priests and bishops of the church. Wow. So I conducted investigations later, as late as 5 years ago or so, meeting some of these bishops who were still alive and having correspondence with them and interviewing them, and it's a wild story. It's just unbelievably strange. Profeta had managed to get Hoover to give him a kind of, I don't know what you would call it, a kind of blessing to start the church, and he was using the FBI security people to check the references of people who wanted to become bishops in his church. It was a very incestuous relationship between the AOCC and the FBI. The AOCC was used to move agents into and out of the country, even when I was there. During the Biafran Civil War in Nigeria, we had a bishop, a so-called bishop, come in from Nigeria to be consecrated a bishop in New York by Profeta and sent back into Nigeria. Could never figure what that was all about. But this bishop was the anti-Biafran forces. He represented the nationalist forces, So wherever there was a good side or a bad side, Profeta was always on the bad side of any conflict. So I met this guy myself. I was there at the airport to welcome him into the country. And his name was Aluya, but it was Holy Prophet Aluya. That was his name. So in his ordination or consecration documents, he's there as Bishop H.P. Aluya. Bishop Holy Prophet Aluya. I wasn't even sure if this guy was Christian, because he was bishop in the church. There was always an intelligence angle to everything Professor was doing. There was always some weird agenda. There were always some strange people coming in and going out. And as I found out later, the AOCC was still involved as late as the Serbian and Kosovo crisis. I mean, there's members of the church that I knew back in the 1960s who were involved in running guns and laundering money for some of the Serbian war criminals. So, they've been around for a long time, and they always seem to be involved in something intelligence related, and always on the anti-communist or the right-wing or fascist side.
Someone from the government contacted you trying to get you to spy for them?
Well, it wasn't like that. What happened was, one of the whole reasons for this church and everything else, of course, was to give us a kind of a shield where the draft was concerned. And as long as we were conducting services, as long as we were behaving as clergymen and doing what we could, it was a legitimate shield. But we still had to have the imprimatur of the selected service people in order to make sure we weren't drafted. And what we had to do was go to the head of selective service in New York City. And I had a meeting with him, with another clergyman of this American Orthodox Catholic Church of the AOCC. We had a meeting with the head of the selective service operation of that selective service system in New York City, a colonel. He had the rank of colonel in the Army, I suppose, but he wore civilian clothes. And very sort of John, or let's say Alan Dulles appearance, patches on the elbows, a tweed jacket, mustache, and pipe. And he sat there and he gave me the 4D status, which is the ministerial deferment, right there. Mm-hmm. But normally you don't get that from the head of selective service, right? It's something that's processed through paperwork.
Right.
But this was done face to face, and there was an understanding, that we're all in this thing together, and that the Orthodox churches are somewhat suspect. Some of the Russian churches were running spies into the U.S. from Moscow. Oh. We knew this. This was even covered in the newspapers at the time.
Okay.
So there was this understanding there was going to be a quid pro quo. So
for you to spy on other clergy for the government,
right,
in exchange for your draft
deferment. For my deferment, right.
Okay. And so, did you actually do this for a while? Did you report?
Well, there was nothing to report.
Okay.
It was all sort of stupid. I mean, we would go to the Russian Orthodox Church because we were trying to form relationships with other Orthodox churches. And
All right, Tracy R. Twyman back with you at the Plus Ultra podcast. We're talking to author and international man of mystery, Peter Levinda. So you've heard about Levinda's involvement with the Slavonic Orthodox Church. Now here comes the part where he describes his involvement with the publication of a text known as the Necronomicon. Many of you are familiar with the references to this legendary grimoire in the short stories of American horror writer H.P. Lovecraft from the early 20th century. Lovecraft describes it as this long sought-after, super-secret, super-dangerous, magical text. It contains spells to call up primordial demons from a time before time, the Great Old Ones, as he called them. They once ruled the earth, but were overthrown by newer gods, somewhat like the Titans were overthrown by the Olympian gods. Yet they still lie, dead but dreaming, according to Lovecraft, underneath the surface of the earth, waiting to be brought back to life by the satanic rites of cultists who secretly worship them. And when they rise again, chaos will reign supreme. The Necronomicon was always thought to be nothing but a fictional element in Lovecraft's stories, and it became an integral part of some of the stories written by his colleagues as well. Many more copycat stories followed after Lovecraft's death. Today, experts on literature refer to these stories as part of what they call the Cthulhu mythos, named after the main figure in the hierarchy of Lovecraft's Great Old Ones, Cthulhu. There are literally thousands of books, short stories, movies, rock bands, and role-playing games that make use of the Cthulhu mythos, or refer to the Necronomicon. Part of this is because of the popularity of Lovecraft, which has grown exponentially since his death. But part of it is also because in the 1970s, a book was published claiming to be the actual Necronomicon. It was allegedly written by an Arab magician, writing in Greek, and reiterating magical spells that stemmed supposedly from ancient Sumeria. It tells how to use the magical power of the elder gods, the good gods of Sumeria, to protect the planet from the evils of the ancient ones, the bad gods, the equivalent to Lovecraft's great old ones. When I first interviewed Peter Levenda in 1999 for Dagobert's Revenge magazine, I asked him mainly about his book that was out at the time, Unholy Alliance, about Nazi occultism. But during the week that I was preparing the interview questions, I happened to pop open my copy of the 1970s Necronomicon for some odd reason, and I noticed for the first time that Peter Levenda was mentioned in the acknowledgments. I thought this was an amazing coincidence, as I had owned the book since I was 12, but had only recently discovered the author Peter Levenda. So I asked Mr. Levenda about it in the interview, and he replied that he had been involved in some of the translations for the book. Many years later, I came across an article in the New York Press called The Doom That Came to Chelsea, written by Alan Cabal. In it, the author claimed to have been involved with the circle of occultists in New York that had been responsible for publishing the Necronomicon, and that the whole thing had been fabricated by the person who is credited as the editor in the Necronomicon, known by the alias Simon. Alan Cabal claimed that Simon was, in fact, Peter Levenda. I quote, "Into this bubbling swamp of spiritual fecundity stepped Peter Levenda, aka Simon. Charming, soft-spoken, and aloof, well-versed in all aspects of occult theory and practice, he eased his way into the center of the scene. The text itself was Levenda's creation, a synthesis of Sumerian and later Babylonian myths, and text peppered with names of entities from H.P. Lovecraft's notorious and enormously popular Cthulhu stories. Simon was also Levenda's creation. He cultivated an elusive, secretive persona, giving him a fantastic and blatantly implausible line of bullshit to cover the book's origins. He had no telephone. He always wore business suits, in stark contrast to the flamboyant, Renaissance fair, proto-goth costuming that dominated the scene. He never got high in public. In short, he knew the signifiers and emblems of authority, and played them to the hilt. He hinted broadly of dealings with intelligence agencies and secret societies operating at global levels of social influence. So when I set up this latest interview, I decided to ask Peter Levenda about these accusations. In fact, it turned out that a book had recently been published, written by this mysterious Simon, detailing the alleged genesis of the Necronomicon. So I read the book, which Peter Levenda kindly provided me a copy of, and then I asked him some pointed questions. Now, let's talk about the Necronomicon to the extent that you're willing to. Now, you saw the sort of pre-interview questions that I sent you. You can see what I'm thinking. After I read Dead Names, which is credited to the author Simon, who's also the person who is listed as the editor of the Necronomicon. Right. After I read that, I gotta say that there's a lot of similarities between Simon and you, and it's hard for me, unless you give me some other information, it really seems like you are Simon. Am I wrong?
Well, a lot of people make that assumption, and it's at this point, after so many years, that assumption's been made a lot. I mean, there have been other assumptions made as well. I mean, that Simon was Herman Slater or Larry Barnes or some combination of the two, or even other people that I recently received an email from somebody who said it was someone else that I knew years ago. It's a false assumption. However, the similarities might be due to the fact that I occasionally edit other people's work, especially when their grammar and their English isn't that great. So there might be a stamp of my English language ability on it or something. But Simon's definitely a different person.
Okay.
And
but you were involved in the editing this latest book, Dead Names.
Yeah, how shall I put it? In an informal sort of way. I just said, let me look at it, let me pull it into shape. Especially because a lot of it was about me, so.
Yeah, well.
I wanted to make sure that, nothing too outrageous was being said.
I mean, really, that's what part of it that made me think, really, that you were him, is that, a large portion of the book is about you and your life, your teenagehood that you've already described for us, and, it seemed like it was building up to something, and then it sort of switches all of a sudden to being about Simon, and, there's no... It ends up with you being, I guess, a translator for the Necronomicon, but it seemed to me like, since it was telling your own life details in such great detail, that it seemed like I was a bit surprised that you ended up being somewhat of a minor character in the end to the whole story.
Well, it was, the thing is that the story of the discovery of the book is really bound up with the church. And you can't really tell the story without telling the story of the church, which is in itself a pretty good story.
So
and I believe the decision was made, we can't tell this story because people have to know how this happened.
Okay. So,
if we just say it was discovered by a couple of monks from this church, well, that information has been out there all along.
In the church,
been out there.
Sorry to interrupt.
In the literature, it's been out there in the in various introductions or prefaces to various editions of the Necronomicon. I think it was mentioned in the Necronomicon spell book. So the ideas were out there, and we were always kind of astonished that nobody picked up on it and developed the leads that we gave. There were clues here and there, about what had happened and what had transpired, and no one really followed up. There was always this clamor of, is the book real or is it not? Who's Simon and everything. But the information was always out there. It's just that nobody bothered to look. So I think in their names, the idea was let's put this to rest. Let's tell the story as it happened.
And the church you're referring to is the Slavonic Orthodox Church that you and Andrew started when you were teenagers. Okay, so if you wouldn't mind just giving us a short version of it, how did the Slavonic Orthodox Church somehow, how were they involved in the discovery and the publication of the Necronomicon?
Well, it goes back to back in the 1970s. The church had been started. We were involved with the AOCC, as I mentioned before, the American Orthodox Catholic Church. I pretty much was defecting from the whole thing. All the intelligence stuff that was going on, all the politics, all of the backstabbing, sort of pissing me off. And Andrew was in a mode of self-glorification to the point where it was getting, the oxygen was very thin around him. Was defecting from the whole thing. All the intelligence stuff that was going on, all the politics, all of the backstabbing, sort of pissing me off. And Andrew was in a mode of self-glorification to the point where it was getting, the oxygen was very thin around him. So he eventually formed an alliance with another Ukrainian Orthodox church and formed, a kind of a sustainable lifestyle based on that. And he had a lot of other priests and monks from different denominations, different Orthodox churches who joined his church, especially once he had the kind of legitimacy of his involvement with some legitimate Orthodox churches. So he attracted some other people, but some of the people he attracted were less than savory characters. And two of them were monks who were involved in rare book theft. These were guys who made their living going from library to library, whether it was university libraries, public libraries, personal collections, and stealing books. And they would steal these books. They had these big voluminous robes that we mentioned at the beginning of the program. And they would hide books. They would take them out to a van that they had that had equipment in there for erasing the ink markings of libraries, for raising the seals, like the impressions of the, I don't know what to call them, like the paper seals from the libraries, so they could eradicate all this stuff and then sell the books, to collectors. They were making a living doing this, and they were based in New York City. They had an operation in Queens, in Jamaica, Queens, and they had equipment up there for processing these stolen books. And they would occasionally rebind them, or they would tear out the illustrations and the maps and sell them separately, which was, a horrible crime.
Yes.
It was absolutely horrible and unbelievable. So they would do that. And they belonged to the Slavonic Orthodox Church. And Andrew knew about this. He knew what they were up to, and as long as they were kicking back stuff to him, he didn't really mind it very much, as long as they didn't involve him in the actual theft. So Andrew's interest was always in books of an occult nature. So he had a small collection, a growing collection of old tomes, of various kinds. And as it turned out, he had stacks of things in boxes, manuscripts, and all that sort of thing. I was over there one day, and the rest is history. Opened up the box and saw a manuscript with a Greek name, and we didn't know what it meant, Necronomicon. We thought, it means something to do with the dead. You have to understand that we didn't read H.P. Lovecraft. We weren't reading that stuff. We had no knowledge of it back in the 70s. it wasn't part of our lifestyle, to read occult fiction.
So you'd never heard of
Gothic horror stuff. It just wasn't there. We didn't know. So for us, the name meant nothing. Just that it meant something to do with death. With death, and there were some strange sigils and stuff in it, and it looked pretty cool. And that was really the discovery of it. I mean, it was just right there. We said, let's do something with this.
So you borrowed it for a while, photocopied it, and then gave it back.
Right.
And it ended up disappearing, right?
The original, yes. This was due to the fact that these book thieves then were shortly thereafter arrested by the feds. And their arrest made national headlines. They made headlines in the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, everywhere, front page, below the fold, but front page. It was the largest rare book heist in the history of the United States. These guys had pulled off something unbelievable. And there's lists, very partial lists, in the newspaper accounts of the universities they had gone to and the books that they had stolen. And it's, like I say, very partial. They had stolen books all over the country, including Canada and Mexico. So I think they had to make restitution somehow, give back the books they did have. They still had in their possession, and give an accounting of other books. But, I mean, the task was daunting. There's so many books that had been stolen that I don't know if they ever gave a full accounting. But the documentation that exists is only that they stole books from all the major libraries, from all the major universities, some of which were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. So when they were arrested, Andrew went nuts. He was very frightened that he was going to be implicated in all of this, so he destroyed whatever he had that the monks had given him to make sure that he would not be implicated.
So do you think it's possible that that's when the original of the Necronomicon was destroyed?
Well, the one that I saw, I'm sure, was destroyed. He destroyed everything. I mean, he had some very good books there. It was a shame. He had some old books on astrology, on palmistry, different languages, French and Latin. I mean, there was a lot of interesting stuff that he had, which disappeared. I mean, after he died, no one's seen it. No one's seen any of it. He destroyed a lot of stuff. I mean, there was a lot of political stuff around Andrew lately, towards the end of his life as well. So, he kept those, he had some ornate furnaces, stoves, these porcelain stoves like from the Renaissance period, some beautiful pieces of, he was an antique collector, he loved antiques. And he, these were coal-fired, and he just kept those things running day and night, from what I understand, as he was burning, a lot of stuff that he had. Scared to death, he would wind up in jail along with the monks who belonged to his church.
And how did he end up dying? Is he dead?
Well, it's a little spooky. People say it was suicide, and probably that's what it was. One of his hobbies was in gilding metal. So he would, put gold leaf on something, or he would play with metals a lot and with gilt. And you use arsenic in that process of electroplating. And the story is that somehow a vial of arsenic fell and he died from the fumes. But the story doesn't hold water because he had a cat in the laboratory with him, his little place in the Bronx, and the cat survived. He didn't die from any fumes. It appears as though it was either murder or suicide.
Wow.
It might have been suicide. His father had committed suicide a few years before.
Right.
So it's possible that the guilt of it had just weighed upon him. But there were political situations as well. The Ukrainian church that he was involved with suddenly came into its own with the fall of the Soviet Union. And the life that he had been living up until then was being threatened. The heads of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church from the Ukraine were coming to the United States to kind of reassert their authority over the parishes and the dioceses here. And I think that Andrew knew he was on his way out one way or the other. So who knows? It could have been a combination of things. I just don't know.
Well, it's so interesting, there's so many of these things in history, and you discuss a lot of them in your books, where something really significant happened, and then the proof of it disappears. And it's happened to me too, so I know it happens.
Sure, it happens a lot.
But it seems to happen really, with these significant documents. I mean, I guess you have a little bit of sympathy for Joseph Smith in a way. His original gold plates disappeared.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it happens. It sort of happens all the time.
So the story is just at this point you were hanging out at the Magical Child shop. You knew Simon, and you still knew Andrew, and you knew that you became aware that he had this book, and so you copied it for yourself and gave it back, and then you and Simon and I guess some other people translated it and prepared it for publication.
That's right.
Okay, and then it basically spent a little while in low circulation with limited edition copies being printed, and then Avon Books printed a paperback version, and it became this huge hit.
Yeah, we didn't expect it. We had done a lot of thinking about this book. I mean, it was Herman Slater who said, you've got to be kidding me. You don't have the real Necronomicon, do you? And we said, well, what is that? And he said, you have to be kidding. You don't know Lovecraft. You don't know any of this stuff. And we said, no. And it was Herman Slater who was instrumental in saying, no, this book has got to find a publisher. And he tried to find a publisher on his own a number of times, and he just couldn't find one. Like, nobody was interested. And then L.K. Larry Barnes showed up one day, deliberately looking for the Necronomicon, because he was a Lovecraft fanatic, and he saw an occult story, so he figured, I'll go in and ask, He went in and asked, and Herman Slater had the manuscript there. I mean, the translated, thing. And he said, "Well, here, yeah, we do have it." So at that point, Barnes, who was a printer, was involved in the printing trade. His father was a printer. Decided that he would want to print the book himself, and so we did a limited edition in leather. So that came out. I think it was 3 editions altogether, or limited editions. It sort of fell out of it after a while, but they went through a number of editions, and then the thing got sold to Avon as a paperback, and it became a phenomenon. L.K. Barnes was pretty good, though. The Barnes' sense for advertising and marketing was pretty good. He loved to design advertising, and he would put full-page ads in magazines as disparate as National Lampoon and Psychology Today. Full-page ads for the Necronomicon. And what a bizarre approach, but it worked. It got a lot of coverage from a lot of places, and naturally the book was attacked immediately as soon as it came out. This is not the Necronomicon. This is a horrible pastiche. It's a horrible hoax. It's so poor. It's so pathetic. It isn't really even Lovecraft, and all of that went on. As far as I was concerned, the fact that it wasn't really Lovecraft meant that it probably was, the real Necronomicon.
Right, yeah.
If it was a hoax, it would have been a lot better than what it was.
Because when Lovecraft was around, nobody really knew much about Sumeria, did they?
No. I mean, Sumeria was discovered. I mean, they knew about it, I think, World War I period. I mean, before he died, information had come out about Sumeria, but it wasn't a lot. The tablets hadn't been translated until years after, I think, after he died. So the major Sumerian works hadn't come out yet, in print. The Enuma Elish and all of the other creation epics and stuff. I don't think that came out while he was alive. I'm not sure now that you asked, but I don't think the stuff was out yet. So it's unusual that, his references to it matched, with some of the Sumerian stuff that came out later.
But he wouldn't have been able to imagine that the Necronomicon was, a partially Sumerian text or based on a Sumerian text, because
no, I doubt that very much. I don't think he could have gone there. Really.
Right. Okay, we'll be back with more from Peter Levenda about the Necronomicon after these messages from our sponsors. Hi, this is Tracy R. Twyman. From 1996 to 2003, my magazine, Daggerbert's Revenge, was a beacon to those seeking the light of the Holy Grail. Long before the hype of the Da Vinci Code, Daggerbert's Revenge was the world's only magazine devoted to the subjects of the Priory of Zion, the Merovingians, the Grail Bloodline, Mary Magdalene, the Knights Templar, the Rennes-le-Chateau Enigma, secret societies, esoteric history, and occult symbolism. Way ahead of its time, the well-researched, in-depth articles found in Dagobert's Revenge even traced the mysteries back to their origins in ancient Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, and Atlantis. They delved deep into the hidden wisdom of the Bible, Freemasonry, and the myths of our ancestors. They even brought in the topic of fallen angels and the superhuman race of beings known as the Nephilim. Dagobert's Revenge was a totally unique publication. Nothing like it has been seen before or since. When it ceased publication in 2003, thousands of loyal readers were left hungry for more. Back issues quickly became high-priced collector's items. So for those who love Dagobert's Revenge, or for those who never had a chance to read it, one book is essential for your library. It's The Arcadian Mystique, The Best of Dagobert's Revenge, published by Dragon Key Press. It even includes bonus articles that were never featured in the print publication. Pick up your copy today at Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, or TracyRTwyman.com. And visit TracyRTwyman.com to learn how you can bid on rare back issues of Dagobert's Revenge as they come up for auction. Alright, we're back at the Plus Ultra podcast. This is Tracy R. Twyman, and now here's more from Peter Levinda. So back to your story. Okay, so there was a major meaningful coincidence that happened there where Herman Slater has this Necronomicon, what he believes to be the Necronomicon, but he can't find a publisher for it. And, right. So all of a sudden, this guy who happens to be really into the occult and into Lovecraft, he just almost on a whim walks into the store and asks if you've ever heard of the Necronomicon or if you have the Necronomicon, not really expecting you to say yes. And then exactly. Herman Slater says, yeah, I have it right here. And then it turns out that this guy is a publisher.
Right, imagine the rush, right?
Oh, yeah.
When you go into a store and say, offhandedly, you have the Necronomicon, and someone says, yeah. So it was quite a rush for him. I mean, it changed his life. It was a major influence, on him. I mean, he was focused on it 100% after that. Broken only briefly by the death of Elvis Presley, whom he idolized as well, and he made an Elvis Presley calendar or something. But in the midst of the Necronomicon, he was really totally focused on it, on creating the most beautiful possible edition he could. And quite frankly, I think that that first edition, that first Thunder edition, was a little tacky. It was just too much silver and too many gargoyle-ish looking emblems, too much eldritch stuff on there. But anyway, he liked it, and it was very successful. The first edition sold out before it was even printed. Mm-hmm. I mean, it sold out strictly word of mouth. So it paid for itself. And then the other two editions after that, and finally Avon picked it up. And I think with Avon it sold, close to 1 million copies since it came out in 1980, I think.
1 million?
So, that's not really a bestseller in terms of the New York Times, but it's, it's steady.
Simon and also William S. Burroughs, who wrote a letter after he read the Necronomicon, wrote a letter to you guys. They both seem to think that the publication of the Necronomicon was a historically significant event, that this is going to have a major ripple effect, or that it has already had a major ripple effect on public consciousness, pop culture, history. I mean, do you agree with that? Do you think that it was an important event?
Well, yeah, I think it was important in several different ways. In the first place, where the New Age is concerned, a lot of the occultism is Judeo-Christian, let's say. The Keys of Solomon, the books of the 6th, 7th, and 8th books of Moses, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it was all based upon a Jewish and Christian concept. But with the coming of the New Age, you had a lot of neo-paganism. And there was not a system of ceremonial magic designed for a neo-pagan mentality. It was all based upon, Jewish and Christian concepts, which were themselves borrowed from pagan, origins. Mm-hmm. But the pagan origins were gone. I mean, for the most part, there were no texts about that. So I think, in a sense, the Necronomicon kind of filled a need for people with neo-pagan sensibilities to become involved in the higher magic, shall we say. That's one thing. That's very specific, I suppose. But that's one thing. That's very specific, I suppose. But on another level, the Necronomicon, the publication of a book called the Necronomicon, no matter what Necronomicon it is, I think raises a lot of questions that have become very controversial, and that is, what is a true book? It questions the value of pseudoepigrapha, for instance. I mean, the Key of Solomon was not written by Solomon, right? There's false attributions to it. The Gardnerian Book of Shadows was written by Gerald Gardner, who was written by some ancient, pagan witches a couple of thousand years ago or 100 years ago. So we have to ask ourselves, where is the value? The Necronomicon itself forces people to question, what do we really value? Do we value an ancient text because it's ancient, or do we value it because it has something else to offer us? There's a new text with ancient patina, let's say. Is it just as valuable as a new text or a genuine ancient text? I mean, it asks a lot of questions, and it forces people to confront the question of dealing with the dark side. All occultism essentially deals with the other. It deals with another reality. It may deal with the dark side of human consciousness, even if it's angelic magic, even if it's Jewish mysticism, Kabbalistic occultism, or anything like that. It's still dealing with the dark side. It's dealing with the unseen. And the Necronomicon is sort of in your face about that. I mean, the Necronomicon is all about the unseen, and it's all about the dark side, and it makes no apology for it. And maybe it answers some need, in people by saying, this is a book about darkness. It's how to protect yourself against it. It doesn't dwell on, forming pacts, with Satan or something. It's not like that. But it does deal with darkness. It deals with a pre-Judeo-Christian mentality where religion and magic is concerned. And maybe it's valuable for that reason. Maybe it represents unresolved issues.
In the Sumerian worldview that was reflected in this text, the good gods are only good because they're not as bad as the bad gods, right? They're the bad gods want to come and kill us and eat us, basically, right. And then the good gods are the ones that created us and sort of forgot about us, and they don't really answer our prayers unless we really do something to wake them up.
Right, and it isn't that, an eloquent, statement of our human condition at the moment. I mean, sometimes I wonder if maybe this whole war between the forces of light and the forces of darkness is just, alien versus predator, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a plague on both your houses. Maybe for us, it's a question of just choosing sides. It's not a question of right and wrong. It's not a question of a moral, spiritual force. Maybe the spiritual forces are amoral, or their morality is something beyond our understanding. Among the evangelicals, they have what they call discernment, right? Right. So, someone is being possessed, or there's a spirit. You have to figure out, is it a good spirit or a bad spirit? Because, a bad spirit can appear just as charming as a good spirit, right? I mean, Satan hardly ever shows up, with horns and a tail. He shows up probably in a business suit, three-piece and, monogram cufflinks. I mean, who knows, unless you really have a fine-tuned sensitivity, who knows what's evil or good or what's beneficial for the human race or not. We're being torn apart by all sorts of moral decisions that we're faced with now. But I don't think the world in general really had to face for a long time. I mean, World War II, it seemed pretty obvious who the good guys and the bad guys were, We pretty much thought we knew in those days. And then everything changed, and then we made a lot of very dubious moral choices, particularly with bringing the Nazis over and, getting into bed with them and supporting the Nazis all over the place. We said to ourselves, well, better dead than red and all this other stuff. And, we made some very, very strange moral choices, and now we're paying for that, we're paying for it in Iraq, which, oddly enough, is the place where the Necronomicon would have come from. Right. Coming all back to the beginning here. Yeah. You mentioned something that basically is the note you ended on in your book series. You were talking about the influence of sinister forces throughout the American history, and you ended by saying that America
basically made a pact with the devil when they decided to bring in Nazi scientists after World War II, and that what you refer to as a spirit of fascism has been possessing the United States ever since then, that we've been permanently cursed because of this. Is that a fair representation of what you were saying?
Yeah, I hope the word permanent is not operational, but I think we did. We sold our soul at that point. We fell for the trap. These were people who were responsible for some of the most horrific crimes humanity has ever known. Unspeakable horror that they created. And somehow we were willing to overlook that. And we should have been better than that. We should have said nothing is worth supporting people like this, bringing them over and, giving them salaries and giving them houses and saying, work for us. Nothing should have been worth that. Nothing should have been worth covering for people like Klaus Barbie, for instance, the butcher in Lyon, or any of the other people we brought over, we coddled, we protected from going to justice. Back in the 1940s, after the war, people like Eleanor Roosevelt and Albert Einstein, they were holding meetings saying, please stop bringing the Nazis over. This is horrible. This is reprehensible. Even Truman issued an order to the Pentagon to stop doing it, and they ignored him. There was a point at which we thought that dealing with the Nazis was okay. And it extended until the 1950s and the 1960s. I mean, the World Anti-Communist League that helped Reagan get elected president was riddled with people who were involved in war crimes. VRL Trifa, the bishop of the Romanian Orthodox Church for many years, was really an Iron Guard Nazi back in Romania, who was a fake bishop. He basically took over the Romanian Orthodox Church here by force. And we supported him. We protected him. Nixon protected Nazi war criminals. He went out of his way to do it. I mean, Dulles protected them. We protected people who were monsters, people who had no moral compass whatsoever. And in doing that, it's like the old stories of, you invite the vampire into your house, right? Unless you invite him, he can't come in. Well, we invited him.
And the excuse for Project Paperclip, bringing over Nazis to work in our NASA and intelligence organizations, is that we didn't want the Soviets to get them, so we had to take them instead. But really, we could have just killed them or imprisoned them for life, too, right?
Of course. I mean, it wasn't a question of either or, If we had captured these Nazi scientists, then we could capture them and make them stand trial and send them to prison. The Russians wouldn't have gotten them.
Well, I have to agree with you there. And I think it's time that we bring this marathon interview to an end. But I thank you very much for your cooperation. As you know, I love your work, and I would recommend to anyone Unholy Alliance and Sinister Forces, Volumes 1, 2, and 3. And for that matter, the Necronomicon. And he has a website. Go ahead with your...
Yes, it's www.sinisterforces.info, I-N-F-O.
All right, thanks, Peter. Talk to you later.
Thank you very much, Tracy.
All right, that was Peter Levinda. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with him. We're about to say goodbye here at Plus Ultra. As always, I would like to thank Kevin L. Thompson of Iota Alpha Omega for the theme song, and Brian Albert for designing the Plus Ultra coat of arms. And for every episode of the Plus Ultra podcast, I will always remind you that my views which I express are not necessarily shared by our guests, our contributors, or our advertisers, and of course their views are not necessarily shared by me. Today's bumper music was brought to you by Luke the Wizard from Slovenia. You can find his music in the Kavi Collective Archive at kahvi.org. That's kahvi.org. Right now I'm going to play for you a song by the band Keter. That's Kether. You can find them on MySpace. They've got a new single out now about the mystery of Rennes-le-Chateau. It's called Walking on Gold, and it features a clip culled from a TV interview I did in 1998. They sampled me saying the words Vatican Conspiracy. So here it is, Walking on Gold by Keter. Until next time, don't be afraid to venture beyond.